Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
And welcome to another episode of the Examined Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. So this week, I'm going to be going through an essay that I researched, wrote, and prepared for the 48th meeting of the Society for Pentecostal Studies called What is Toxic? Analyzing Masculinity in American Society. Now, I did not give that essay at the Society for Pentecostal Studies meeting because they canceled the meeting due to the coronavirus. So I'd actually originally planned on at some point giving a version of this essay as a podcast here, and I'd been hoping that I could do that after the conference so I could then relate what kind of feedback I got on the essay, positive, negative, whatever. Maybe even have a recording of the Q&A session like I was able to do for the one on inerrancy that I gave at the Society for Pentecostal Studies last year. But unfortunately, that's not to be. Now, I'm not sure exactly, but there's a chance that they're just going to push the whole conference off to next year, and everybody who had essays accepted for it will then be giving it at the 49th annual meeting instead of the 48th one. There's still talk as to what they're going to do about that, so I don't know. But anyhow, that's the essay I'm going to go through here, which I think the title's self-explanatory. I'm going to be talking about what is toxic. There's something toxic about masculinity, about American society, or both, and all the various issues and complexities involved therein, at least as much as I can do in about an hour. This is a much bigger topic than you can cover completely in an hour, as with most things I do on here. So I'll just get right into the essay here. And as usual, when I read my essays for the podcast, I'll try and do some more asides and read it in normal language as much as possible, as opposed to philosophical essay language, because that can be a little off-putting. So, on November 7th, 2018, Ian David Long walked into the Borderline Bar and Grill in California. He opened fire and unleashed more than 50 rounds into the crowd, killing 12 people and wounding one, and then he ultimately killed himself. Now, Long had been a 4-year veteran of the Marine Corps and had had previous run-ins with law enforcement as well as mental health issues. 7 years prior to this, his marriage had failed, and he'd since been living with his mother, who later said to people that she was in fear of what her son might do. He had attempted to pursue a sports medicine-related degree, but dropped out because, by his own account, a patient had talked down to him and bruised his ego. So, naturally, in the aftermath of his mass murder, there was lots of speculation about the possibility of that he had some PTSD and some other mental health problems. Now, Long also fit the pattern of what many people, especially in the media, have called toxic masculinity. He was a war veteran, he had a failed marriage, was described as a loner, was living with his mother, and he seemed to have no prospects for a career or other successes in life. He just really wasn't seeming to do anything but sit around and fail, essentially. Now, certainly, part of this speculation is because the talk and denunciation of, quote, toxic masculinity is very, very prominent in media and other places today. As an example of this, in a recent article in The Atlantic, The Miseducation of the American Boy, Peggy Orenstein says that, and I quote, "While following the conventional script may still bring social and professional rewards to boys and men, research shows that those who rigidly adhere to certain masculine norms are not only more likely to harass and bully others, but to themselves be victims of verbal or physical violence. They're more prone to binge drinking, risky sexual behavior, and getting in car accidents. They are also less happy than other guys with higher depression rates and fewer friends in whom they can confide." End quote. Now, the problem with Orenstein's article here is that she actually does not cite any research or mention any studies, or give any other information that would allow the reader to look into her claim. She flat out says, research shows that people who adhere to traditional masculine norms have all these problems. But she cites none of that and doesn't give you any way to go look up that claim whatsoever. She gives no explanation or argument for that claim at all. Now, it's quite likely that she sees no need to cite or point to any such research because her claim is just simply taken for granted by so much of American society today. Regarding traditional masculinity as evil or problematic is now in many places just the default, much like other American assumptions like, say, a need for equality and justice. Now, it's probably not as strong an assumption as those of equality and justice, but the fact that Orenstein cites nothing in support of such a central claim in her article is really quite telling. Now, well, you might want to write off much of the pontificating that Orenstein and other people like her make as the usual nonsense from media that understands very little of what it talks about and actively avoids attempting to learn anything. But at the same time, these same types of claims are being advanced and repeated by respectable academic organizations like the American Psychological Association. The APA associated traditional or toxic masculinity with traits like stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression. They then contrasted this with the traditional feminine that is associated with traits like being compassionate, nurturing, kind, and issued guidelines claiming that traditional masculinity is harmful and psychologists should work against it. Or a little bit further back in 2007, Harvey Mansfield, a tenured professor at Harvard, at least at that time, wrote a book titled Manliness. In this book, he defined manliness as an irrational bias in favor of action over reflection. He said that thinking is a challenge for real men. So when the intellectual elite holds such a low view of masculinity as to basically call men stupid, that's a sure sign the culture doesn't see much to value in men. Now, a very similar claim is that it's also often argued that much of the violence against women is driven by too much masculinity, and that's equated with toxic masculinity. The two are often thought of as interchangeably. Being too masculine is toxic masculinity, and vice versa. For example, the theme of the conference that I wrote this essay for was going to be about This Is My Body, about the bodily autonomy of women, and it was to encourage theologians and philosophers at SPS to try and find some ways to address and deal with violence against women around the world and related issues. Well, that call for papers that they put out actually cited and alluded to a United Nations report that claims that violence against women is rooted, at least in part, in patriarchy and structural relationships, that is, traditional relationships, i.e., that's probably kind of an offhand way of referring to masculine or traditional relationships. And while the claim of that UN report, and thus the call for papers for the conference as well, that patriarchy and structural relationships are part of the problem is popular, turn on the news media and you see that basically the same claim everywhere, so it's popular, but this claim is also radically out of step with what the actual data says and what good reasoning tells us. Now, often these same types of claims are also coupled with the idea that American society is primarily masculine at the expense of the feminine. That is, we value the man over the woman, we value masculine things over feminine things. So what I'm actually going to do here is challenge both of these claims by arguing for the following. First, I'm going to argue that American society is primarily feminine as opposed to masculine. That is, the dominant aspects of American culture and society now value traits that are associated with the traditional feminine and demeans traits that are associated with the traditional masculine. Second, I'm going to argue that toxic masculinity, or we could just say men who behave badly, is actually strongly correlated with a lack of masculine influence as opposed to an overabundance of masculinity. That is, if a boy grows up without a father, he's far, far more likely to behave in so-called toxic ways than a comparable boy who grows up with a father is. It's the lack of a masculine influence that leads to bad behavior, not the presence of one or the overabundance of one. And the third point is that it will naturally follow from the second point that combating any so-called toxic masculinity is best done not by opposing things like traditional relationships, structural relationships, or the patriarchy, whatever the crap that is, but by promoting a sense of responsible masculinity in the sense of, say, fathers and other good, strong, and competent male role models. Boys need to learn to be men by seeing and following good examples. And, unsurprisingly, this idea of something we might call responsible masculinity lines up quite well with the teachings of Scripture on how men should behave and what fathers should teach their sons. So before I get into all of that, we kind of need to define our terms here. It's important to just clarify what's actually being talked about. So what is toxic masculinity, or is there even such a thing? Because even though this term is very, very commonly used, it's very rarely defined, much less defined in any sense of rigor or thorough or analytic sense, which is generally the best way you can define terms if you can do that. Now, generally, if something is toxic, that means it's like poisonous, hazardous, or harmful in some way. If I pour a bunch of toxic chemicals on somebody, that's not something to be applauded because they're toxic chemicals. Whereas we all put chemicals on our head every day if we use shampoo, but those aren't toxic chemicals. Hence the distinction there. And further, while giving a strict analytic definition of something like masculinity is rather difficult, that's probably as difficult as answering the question, what is a man? I think there's a common and reasonable usage of the term masculinity, wherein masculinity is just the trait or traits that are either present in men or should be present in men. So, given those just natural definitions, it would follow that toxic masculinity is the presence of a trait or traits that are common to men, but are also hazardous or in some way harmful, either to those men or to other people. Now, this does actually, I think, seem to be more or less what is usually meant by the term, and that's a fairly reasonable definition. However, there's also an assumption lurking behind the usage of this term that needs to be pulled out. That is, are these toxic traits or elements exclusively masculine? The fact that this term is toxic masculinity as opposed to toxic person or toxic humanity, well, and just the way it's commonly used, that argues yes, there's something about these problems or these traits that is exclusively or primarily masculine. The claim seems to be that there either is something toxic about masculinity itself, and or there are some ways that masculinity can go wrong that the feminine just can't. Now, it seems perfectly clear to me that this first option, that is, that there's something just wrong with masculinity itself, there's something toxic about it, that's what the APA is claiming, that's what Mansfield is claiming, and that's what many others, such as the philosopher Carol Gilligan, has wrote. Gilligan wrote this explicitly in one of her books, saying, and I quote, "If boys in early childhood resist the break between inner and outer worlds, they are resisting in intuition into masculinity or manhood, as it is defined and established in cultures that value or valorize heroism, honor, war, and competition. The culture of warriors, the economy of capitalism. To be a real boy or man in such cultures means to be able to hurt without feeling hurt, to separate without feeling sadness or loss, and then to inflict hurt and separation on others. What is at stake is boys' manhood, boys' masculinity, their birthright in a patriarchal social order. But this competition of manhood places boys and men psychologically and often physically at risk." So it's quite clear to me that Gilligan, Ornstein, Mansfield, and many others think that there is just something inherently wrong with being masculine, at least masculine in the sense that it's been understood for several thousand years of society until relatively recently. But conversely, there's also the second option, that it's just that there are things that are bad that men tend to do, and those bad things are exclusively masculine. That is, it's not something wrong with masculinity itself, but it's the idea that, hey, when men go bad, they tend to go bad in a certain way, and when women go bad, they don't go bad in that certain way. But this option is also quite problematic, as for all the bad things men have done, women have also done them. It's very true that men have sexually harassed women. It's not as common, but it has happened that women have sexually harassed men. Men have abused, injured, and murdered women. But, again, not as commonly, but it has happened that women have abused, injured, and murdered men. But it's possible to rescue the second option from this problem here by just weakening it a little bit to say that when men go bad, they tend to go bad in certain ways. But it is also the case that a man who is behaving badly will tend to behave badly in a certain set of ways, while a woman who may also behave badly in those same ways, but these problems, these traits, these toxic things are more likely to be found in men than in women. You're more likely and more often going to see a man go bad in these ways than a woman. So that tendency is what we call toxic masculinity. And if that is what is meant by toxic masculinity, then it's, on the face of it, just kind of a reasonable claim, and there's data to support it. Men commit most of the violent crimes in society. Men make up most of the prison population, and men are arrested far more often than women are. That is, when men tend to go bad, they tend to go bad in certain ways, and that's not exclusively masculine, but it is primarily masculine. At least it certainly seems that way. But the trouble that many people are still going to run into with this fairly reasonable definition is that it also follows from this definition of toxic masculinity that there is such a thing as toxic femininity. But that's something that many of the same people who decry toxic masculinity ignore, don't want to discuss, or just flat out wish to avoid. If there are ways that men tend to go bad that will not exclusively are primarily male, then it would also follow that there are ways that women tend to go bad that will not exclusive are primarily female. And yet there is little or no talk of toxic femininity, and there is typically pushback against people who attempt to talk about any kind of toxic femininity. However, just as there is data to support the idea of toxic masculinity, there's data to support the idea of toxic femininity. Women commit paternity fraud at vastly higher rates than men do. Women falsely accuse men of sexual assault far more often than vice versa. And women also suffer from anxiety and depression at higher rates than men do. So, to conclude the definitional section here, there are really only two reasonable ways to interpret the term toxic masculinity. Either per Gilligan, Orenstein, and others, there is just something inherently wrong and harmful with masculinity itself, and hence there's something bad about you if you're a man. Or this term simply means that when men go bad, they tend to go bad in certain ways as opposed to women who tend to go bad in other ways. And that's really not that surprising or problematic of a term. It makes perfect sense. Because if we don't reject the common sense notion that men and women have inherent and fundamental differences apart from basic biology, this slightly weakened second definition just makes perfect sense. Just as the way a car malfunctions will often be different from the way a computer malfunctions, so it follows that if men and women are different, they'll also tend to malfunction in different ways. And unsurprisingly, there's a great deal of evidence that men and women do differ in many ways beyond just basic biology. A 2012 report from the UK found that girls prefer fiction, magazines, blogs, and poetry, while boys like comics, nonfiction, and newspapers. And Sumitra Ragapol-Allen, I'm horribly mispronouncing that name. Anyhow, she's a teacher who's had teenage boys build a solar-driven engine from Coke cans and straws and observed that boys are born tinkerers. They have a deep-seated need to rip things apart and decode the inner workings and create stuff. And my wife and I have observed that in our son, who's not even 2 years old now, that he's picking things up and trying to figure out how they work and tear them apart and even destroy them, where our daughter never showed any interest in doing that. Now, additionally, a vocational report on schools from the National Coalition for Women and Girls in Education, or NCWGE, found that, quote, girls are largely absent from traditional male courses, composing only 4% of heating, AC, and refrigeration students, 5% of welding students, 6% of electrical and plumbing or pipe fitting students, and 9% of automotive students. Now, this same report also found that female students account for 98% of cosmology students, 87% of childcare students, and 86% of health-related fields. Now, the NCWGE actually used this report to claim that vocational schools are sexist and reflect the persistence of sex stereotyping and discrimination, rather than looking to the much more easy and obvious explanation that the interests of girls and boys vary, and girls are going to prefer to get into cosmology more than boys are, and boys are going to prefer to get into automotive more than girls are. Further, attributing that discrepancy to sexism alone completely ignores the fact that for the last generation or so, there have been massive amounts of cultural and political pressure for girls to get into vocational and other STEM-related fields and things like that. Under the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, the U.S. Department of Education disburses $1.1 billion to college-level schools for technical and vocational training. Now, that amount was as of 2012, so it's almost certainly higher now. Now, this act requires schools to take aggressive measures to persuade young women to enter non-traditional fields. Additionally, also in 2012, the Obama administration announced that the Department of Education would begin using Title IX to promote more equal access to STEM fields in education. And I could cite many other examples of this, as the cultural and political pressure to get girls and young women into these fields has been really quite strong. Nevertheless, the data seems to indicate that most women and girls simply just don't have an interest in entering these fields, but prefer to be in fields where they actually do things like work with people, such as healthcare and cosmetology. In 2010, women held 64% of the seats in graduate programs in social sciences, 75% in public administration, 78% in veterinary medicine, and 80% in health sciences, i.e. places where they can work with people. Despite 40 years of feminist consciousness rising and gender-neutral pronouns, boys still outnumber girls in aviation and automotive schools, and girls still outnumber boys in fashion and nursing. The common-sense explanation is that the sexes differ in their interests and propensities. And that's a quote from Christina Hoff Sommers. Now, the differences between the sexes are also apparent even as children enter school when they're very, very young. The psychologist Leonard Sachs has observed that most girls would like to please the teacher, but boys are much less likely to care what the teacher thinks about their work. Another study found a rather obvious difference between men and women when it measured the willingness of men and women to have casual sex with an attractive stranger. 70% of the men said yes and seemed quite happy about it. All the women said no, and many indicated that they felt insulted by being propositioned like that. Research has also found that young women are far more likely to talk about relationships than men. The researchers in one study here found that specifically 56% of the women's targets of conversation, but only 25% of the men's targets were friends and relatives. And I guess I should have said this earlier, but I'm going to be mentioning a lot of different studies and research and things like what other people have said as I go through this podcast. Obviously, I can't cite them on a podcast. It would take way too long if I mentioned them all by name. So if you want any of those citations or a way to look up the research or double check it or something, just email me, write in, and ask for it. I'll be happy to send you copies so you can go look all this up for yourself if you're interested in that. Now, the same researchers that I just mentioned also concluded that in gossip, women tend to focus on individuals who participate in their social networks, where men, in contrast, maintain their psychological distance by discussing strangers, acquaintances, and media role models. That is, the women tended to talk about the people who were close to them, and the men tended to avoid doing that. A 2012 study of 2,000 children found that girls were more likely to report that personal disclosure made them feel cared for and understood. That is, they liked talking about their feelings. Boys overall found it to be a waste of time and weird. It's not that the boys felt embarrassed about sharing their feelings, rather, the boys' responses suggested they just didn't see talking about their problems to be a particularly useful activity. And I can say I've found that sentiment in my own life. Most women I've met, most girls I've met, seem to think that talking about relationships is a very good idea, where most men and boys I've known, it's not that they're embarrassed about it, they just see it kind of as a waste of time, and there's other things that are more important and should get done. And while some people will dismiss all this as, I'd say, too simplistic or anachronistic, the reality just is that boys are less agreeable than girls and are less susceptible to anxiety and depression. Boys' interests will tilt toward things, while girls' interests will tilt toward people. Now, this observation squares well with the data I've given above. So, as Jordan Peterson has said, these factors seem to be the most pronounced in Scandinavian societies where gender equality has been pushed to the hardest. This is exactly the opposite of what would be expected by those who insist, ever more loudly, that gender is a social construct. It isn't. This isn't a debate. The data are in. So, since the data indicates there's differences between boys and girls, between the masculine and the feminine, then we need to ask, well, what is the masculine and the feminine? Well, according to the APA, traditional or toxic masculinity is associated with traits like stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression. Conversely, the traditional feminine is associated with traits like being compassionate, nurturing, and kind. The masculine is more concerned with things and ideas, and the feminine is more concerned with people and relationships. So one way to look at this is to look at what the ideal is. So the ideal masculine, I think, would be something like the noble knight or soldier. A man who's strong, competent, and capable, and uses those skills in service of others, either his family, community, or a concept or group that is larger than himself, such as a country, philosophy, business, religion, and so on and so forth. Conversely, we could say that bad or toxic masculinity tends to take two forms, as when men go bad and become toxic, they'll tend to do one of two things. They will either react with violent and often extreme aggression in an attempt to force people in the world around them to adhere to them. They'll attempt to remake the environment to suit their needs. Or they're going to become extremely passive and retreat from virtually all conflict out of fear that they will lose what little they have left. They're going to either get out of everybody's way, or they're going to try and step on everybody, essentially. Now, the key distinction that I see here between the toxic options and the noble one is that of selflessness or selfishness. A noble man will at least attempt to use his strength and skills in the service of others, while a toxic man is primarily or only concerned with himself. So while there's nothing toxic about needing respect, taking desperate and extreme measures to force what looks like respect, but is often actually fear, is a direct result of toxic masculinity. Men who don't feel respected may make up for it by attempting to dominate others. Now, the ideal feminine is something like, I would say, the ideal mother, compassionate, nurturing, and committed to relationship with other people, usually her children and family. The ideal here will also use her skills in service of others, although typically this is going to be your family or other close personal relationships as opposed to an abstract idea, ideal, philosophy, or these other abstract notions that the noble men will often serve. As with toxic masculinity, I think toxic femininity tends to take two forms. Either the toxic woman will become selfish and use her skills only for herself, or she will retain a type of selflessness but apply it very inappropriately. That is, she will attempt to protect victims who are not victims and seeks to stand against threats that are not threats. For example, it's said that women are often verbally more skilled and more ready to manipulate others using these verbally skills. Conversely, men just aren't taught to fight back verbally, and nor often do they want to. Hence, a toxic woman tends to use verbal violence, while the toxic man tends to use physical violence, or the threat thereof. Now, a very important, but perhaps only loosely related point here, is that it's not ideal for any culture or society to be too masculine or too feminine. The ideal society is going to hold these two ideals in balance, as both relationships and feelings and things in action are important. A society that spurns all relationships in favor of only things and ideas is going to quickly die out because nobody's going to get together and have any children. But likewise, a society that spurns all action and literally working problems out will also die out, as nothing will be accomplished. If everybody just sits around and talks about their feelings and never does anything, well, your society is going to die out that way too. Now, I think a further clarification that again should be obvious, but needs to be stated because most discussion about these kind of things in the media is really, really stupid, is that all people, man or woman, will have a mix of the noble and the toxic within them. Even the best of us are not selfless all the time, and even the vilest person will occasionally do something noble, even if it's just accidentally. So, after all that's done, I'm going to say that even if you do adopt a very, very skeptical view of all the data I've just cited and all the ideals it points to, you can still find some very common traits across all cultures. As Leonard Sachs said, there is no enduring culture in which cowardly men are esteemed or in which brave men are held in contempt. There is no enduring culture in which lazy men are celebrated while hard-working men are despised. Well, except perhaps until now. So now, on to the point about how American society is now primarily feminine and not masculine. Well, it has almost certainly not always been this way. America just now values traits that are associated with the feminine over those that are associated with the masculine. In some instances, it actually denigrates and demeans the masculine, and at times this is done for the purpose of elevating the feminine. Hard to get the words out there for some reason, I don't know why. Now, for several reasons, this is actually, I think, the most difficult claim I'm making here to demonstrate. This is the hardest one here. And there are three reasons for this. First, as I've argued elsewhere, both in written work, and I did a podcast episode on this, it was episode 33, How Christians Should Engage with Culture. I made an argument there that it's at best extraordinarily difficult to measure and quantify a culture and society. We can think of culture and society as in some sense analogous to a cloud here, as a cloud quite clearly is something, but its borders are vague and difficult to see. That is, you can see there's a border there, but its border is kind of amorphous. So it is with society and culture. But while the borders are often unclear, we can still say that there are clearly things that are in the cloud and things that are clearly not. And again, so it is with society and culture. Even though the edges and the margins are a little bit unclear, there is things that we can say that are true of American culture and society, and things that are not true of American culture and society. Second problem here is that any critic of any society, including myself, stands within a society, and often it's the very society they're attempting to critique. There almost certainly is an objective point that some critic could stand on to critique, but it's at best extremely difficult for anybody to actually reach that point and stand on it. So there is the problem of being within a system while attempting to see, understand, and critique the system. Not impossible, but difficult. And the third problem here is that no culture or society is static, as they're all constantly changing and in flux. So it's entirely possible that any critic may beat the odds and find a way around the first two problems, only to find that he's critiquing the culture of yesterday that is long since dead and gone. Now, I don't actually have a definitive solution to these three problems, but I do think I have a methodology that kind of avoids all the issues that arise from these problems. So here's what I claim here. To establish that American culture is primarily feminine and that it devalues the masculine, we need to establish what traits are masculine and feminine, and then look at what traits most of American society praises and which it denigrates and demeans. So, how does America treat its men and how does it treat its women? Well, there will not be a monolithic and uniform whole here. If most of what society values are feminine traits, then we can say that that society is feminine. And since I've already gone through and kind of explained, here's what I think the feminine is and here's what I think the masculine is, I'm not going to repeat that. Rather, we can just now dive right into the data and discussion. So first, I would point to the fact that America is awash in discussion of toxic masculinity is itself evidence that American society is not masculine, or at least not too masculine. A society that is too masculine, too far to one side, is unlikely to even talk of toxic masculinity because masculinity will just be the assumed norm. When you're way too far in one direction, it's very difficult to see that you are that far gone. Hence, it's unlikely that ancient societies like the Mongols or the Aztecs would have recognized that they were out of balance because they were way too far gone. And likewise, if America really was primarily masculine, or too masculine as some people claim, then I don't think there really would be any serious internal critiques of toxic masculinity, which there quite clearly are. And in the same vein, when I was talking earlier about what toxic femininity is, did you feel yourself bristle or get offended a little bit? Well, if you did, take that as a sign that American society is not masculine but feminine. It's unlikely that an overly masculine culture would ever take offense at descriptions of toxic femininity, but an overly feminine culture probably would. Now, Helen Smith tells a story in one of her books, the name of the book is Men on Strike, where she was talking to a bartender named Bruce in Washington, D.C. Bruce had never been married, but he says he came close one time. He backed off because his girlfriend would, quote, bring a gun to a fist fight. Over the years, we grew close, and she knew everything about me, and then would throw it in my face when she got mad, which was often. She used her verbal skills to manipulate me. Now, despite this, Bruce kept insisting that she was a wonderful woman, though. Smith observed of this conversation that manipulating a woman the way this girlfriend was manipulating and verbally berating Bruce would be seen as psychologically abusive if he responded in kind. Notice how he kept apologizing for his feelings by stating over and over how wonderful his ex had been. He didn't feel able to see anything negative about his ex. What Smith is pointing out here is, among other things, there's an obvious double standard at work here, because if Bruce had treated his girlfriend that same way, we'd all be decrying him. But when his girlfriend treats Bruce that way, nobody really seems to care.
And not only is there little or no condemnation for a woman who acts that way, Bruce actually felt the need to apologize for speaking ill of his ex.
Or there's another example Smith relates of a veteran named Joe who was a victim of massive amounts of paternity fraud. He said that when he was in the Marine Corps, he was sued by 11 different women for child support. He says, quote, when you are enlisted, much information about you becomes public record. Single mothers who are pressured by state welfare agencies to name a father find enlisted men who are stationed overseas and name them as the father. I got home from Afghanistan and found my bank account emptied out with no recourse, because I missed court hearings that I didn't know were happening and by default became the legal father of a child. It's a huge scam and no one cares. The state gets their money back from a rube and the mother stops getting hounded. Now, anecdotal stories of men like this who are betrayed by the system, society, culture, and at times even their own families abound in the literature on this subject if you just go look for it. Go look in Helen Smith's book, Men on Strike, if you want a good collection of them. And I think, well, it would be fair for people who are objecting to this to counter-argue that anecdotal evidence, even if there's a lot of it, is weak evidence. But this ignores the fact that the actual data we have pairs very, very well with the stories that these men are telling. As a professor named Jim McNamara said, there is ample evidence that all is not well in the world of men and boys. Male suicide rates are 4 times the rates of female suicide in most Western countries. Boys are failing and dropping out of school at an alarming rate. Male health and longevity are deteriorating, while women's are improving. So, in nearly every measurable category of education, boys and men are falling behind, and yet, at best, there's only a minor effort to correct this. Some groups are actually fighting efforts to help boys in school. By the middle of the 2000s, the precariousness of boys and young men in American schools was one of the most thoroughly documented phenomenon in the history of education. However, when some people actually attempted to focus on this problem, groups like the American Association of University of Women and the National Women's Law Center responded with hostility, as they saw this new attempt to focus on boys as part of an organized backlash against the gains of women. Additionally, in Massachusetts, the achievement of girls not only exceeds the achievement of boys in English language arts at all grade levels, girls are generally outperforming boys in math as well. In 2013, women in the United States earned 57% of the bachelor's degrees, 60% of the master's degrees, and 52% of the PhDs, i.e., women are getting more and better degrees than men are. And at least part of the problem here is that education has actually become structured and organized in a way that works very, very well for girls, but not for boys. As schools become more feeling-centered, risk-averse, competition-free, and sedentary, they move further and further from the characteristic sensibilities of boys. Schools just don't appeal to most boys anymore. 2 researchers have actually noted that schools don't assign books that boys would enjoy reading. They said, quote, "Gone are the inspiring biographies of the most important American presidents, inventors, scientists, and entrepreneurs. No military valor, no high adventure. On the other hand, stories about adventurous and brave women abound. Publishers seem more interested in avoiding masculine perspectives or stereotypes than in getting boys to like what they are assigned to read." Now, just imagine the uproar if the U.S. Department of Education were to compile a list of boy-friendly reading materials or even suggest that teachers might familiarize themselves with such things. This would be an affront to decades of non-sexist curriculum development. Now, but as I noted above, during the last 40 to 50 years, there has been a massive political and social push to help girls and young women get into education and get better education. And that's not a bad thing, at least not in and of itself it's not a bad thing. But now this dynamic has actually shifted, and it's the boys and men who are behind, but there is no comparable push to help them. And there are some organizations that are actually actively fighting the few attempts that have been made to help them. So that's one example of how American society isn't masculine anymore. The education system now primarily favors the feminine, and for the most part, the institutions and systems that at work within education don't really seem to care that boys are falling behind and actively fight against efforts to help them. Now, a further point is that many, if not most, Americans actually vote for who they like rather than who has the best policies. Now, of course, the primary reason why most Americans vote for who they vote for is actually party affiliation. But absent that, most people vote for who they like, not who they think is best after doing a detailed analysis of the policies and issues involved. A researcher has actually noted that a candidate's personality is the primary consideration after party affiliation. He says, quote, "Research has shown that voters' perceptions of candidates' personalities, that is, their intelligence, knowledge, their trustworthiness, and their ability to be strong leaders, you wrap all that up as their personality. That also predicts some people's votes very, very well. Additionally, people don't treat good and bad information about a candidate equally. Voters are especially attuned to unfavorable information about political candidates. Learning one bad thing about a candidate does much more damage to that candidate's image than learning one good thing helps." So what this means actually is that many, or most, Americans vote for a candidate based on relational categories. What Americans value in politicians tends to be the same thing they value in friends and other relationships. And it is the feminine, not the masculine, that prioritizes relationships and these types of traits. And thus many, if not most, Americans follow a voting pattern that is more feminine than masculine. Now, a related point here is the rise of intersectional politics, necessitates the rejection of an analytical or reason-based politics, and this is something that flows out of toxic femininity, not toxic masculinity. Part of the way the feminine goes wrong is to value relationship and the validation of experience and feelings above all reason, not to try to hold them equally or in some tension or let one override the other some of the time, but to say your experience and your feelings in the relationship, that always trumps reason. That is something that can come out of toxic femininity, and it's quite clearly wrong. Now, while all the people who embrace intersectional politics and social justice and thick terms like that does cover a wide variety of viewpoints, but a significant portion of people who are in this mindset embrace the validation of feelings and relationships above all else. And you're just not going to get that from toxic masculinity, you're only going to get that from toxic femininity. An additional example of how American society is now primarily feminine we find in the media and the stories we tell. Joseph Campbell popularized the notion that cultures are defined in large part by the myths, or that is, the stories they tell. And I've argued that Campbell's correct elsewhere, as mass media and popular culture does have a very profound influence on society. That was, again, also in podcast 33, where I wrote an essay about that. Now, the trouble here is that media that portrays women as not needing men is celebrated, while the reverse is not. Men in film and television are often either villains or incompetent doofuses. This phenomenon is the Homer simplification of men, according to Bishop Robert Barron. It's a great term that describes it very well. I'd say I love the term, except what's happening is actually quite terrible. Now, Leonard Sachs has also observed this trend, noting that 50 or 60 years ago, mainstream stories of normal boys becoming men were quite common, and he cites examples of movies like The Hustler, Rebel Without a Cause, and authors like William Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway. But he says that today, such movies are rare. We still have masculine heroes in some of our movies, think of Gladiator and he lists Avatar, but scriptwriters seem to be unable to write a believable story about a boy becoming a heroic man without supernatural powers and set in our era. The scriptwriters go back 500 years or more, or they set their heroic epics in a science fiction past, Star Wars, or future, Avatar, or a fantasy world, Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. The point is here that our culture makers, the people who make movies, TV, and other media, are mostly unable or unwilling to tell stories that show a normal boy how he can become a good man. Because while heroes like Iron Man and Captain America are cool, and in the movies they're pretty good men, every boy knows he'll never actually be Iron Man or Captain America. Our culture used to tell stories about how boys could become men, but for the most part we no longer do. And this problem is actually much worse than Sachs lets on, because it's not just that there's an absence of good men in media, there's actually a very large presence of bad men in media. The very toxic masculinity that mass media decries is actually the most prominent way it betrays men. That professor I mentioned before, J.R. McNamara, analyzed the portrayal of men in 650 newspapers, more than 100 magazines, more than 330 hours of television. A total of over 2,000 media articles and segments were analyzed for his study here. What he found is men are predominantly portrayed in mass media as villains, aggressors, perverts, and philanderers. More than 75% of all mass media representations of men and male identity categorized into profiles portrayed men in one of these four ways. In total, more than 80% of media profiles of men were negative, compared with 18.4% of content which showed positive profiles or themes. He concluded that, and I quote here, looking through mass media as a lens or prism, men in contemporary Western societies are presented with a misandric world that devalues, marginalizes, demonizes, objectifies, and tries to change them. In exploring the potential effects of mass media representations, it's important to examine what they don't say as well as what they do say. From this perspective, mass media are not representing valued and respected roles for men. So the point here is that the media shapes the mindset of the culture, and the media seems to mostly agree with Gilligan, Orenstein, and Mansfield that men and masculinity are simply bad. One further example I can point to of how the media tends to be anti-male is how the popular lecturer and author Jordan Peterson was attacked in the media simply because his audience is primarily men. Now, the reverse of this, a woman with a primarily female audience being attacked for it, would almost certainly not happen, at least not without a lot of outcry and outrage. And one further example of the non-masculinity of American society that's been pretty well documented is how courts treat men and women differently. Courts almost exclusively favor the mother and force men to pay child support to mothers, regardless of whether she used false information or made false statements to the man concerning birth control. In a divorce, a man will probably lose much of your income and assets, and may even lose your kids, even if the wife cheats. And you are always cast as the bad guy. People wonder what you did to make your wife cheats. If a man cheats, on the other hand, the wife is the victim, and he's a louse who deserves punishment. And this is probably one of the reasons why there's been a severe decline in the number of marriages in the U.S. In 1970, only 1 in 6 American men aged 25 to 34 had never married. By 2010, 52% of American men aged in that same age group, more than half, had never been married. Many men simply look at the risks involved in marriage and conclude it's just not really worth it. As a consequence, in 2013, more than 40% of American babies were born to unmarried women. And this is projected to get worse, as it's said that by 2030, 45% of working women aged 25 to 44 in the United States will be single. This will be the largest share in history, according to research by Morgan Stanley using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So, to sum up all the data I've given here, men are falling behind in education, and few people either care or advocacy groups are actively fighting to keep it that way. Many people in America vote based on things the feminine sees as virtues as opposed to the masculine. The media is overwhelmingly against anything male or masculine. The courts are often biased against men, especially in divorce courts, and men are increasingly avoiding marriage. If American society is still primarily masculine, it is literally the worst masculine society of all time, as right now, statistically speaking, the average woman fares better in America than the average man does. Now, in Orenstein's mostly clueless article that I mentioned at the start of the podcast here, she did actually manage to stumble across some real nuggets of truth. She said, quote, "When I asked my subjects, as I always did, what they liked about being a boy, most of them drew a blank." "Huh?" mused Josh. "That's interesting. I never really thought about that. You hear a lot more about what is wrong with guys." But unfortunately, Orenstein completely misses the obvious point here, which is that society is going out of its way to tell males that they are awful, unneeded, and unwanted. So going back to those 2 anecdotal stories I mentioned earlier, if the men saying society treats them as disposable are telling the truth, we should expect to see this type of data. The fact that we do see this type of data gives a lot of credence to the stories that would otherwise just be anecdotal. And on top of all this data, consider what would happen if the gender roles were actually reversed in any of the situations I described here. What if women were falling behind in education, constantly being portrayed as incompetent fools by the media, and had the courts biased against them? I submit to you that the outrage of society would be tremendous, and numerous advocacy groups would be trying to do something about this. We know this because it's, at least in part of American social and political history of the last 40 to 50 years that advocacy groups saw those things as problems and were trying to do something about it. So now, where is the outrage and advocacy for men? It's just not there. As Helen Smith summarized it in her book, there truly is a war on men going on in our society, and the average man knows it full well. So that's the end of my first main point about how American society is now feminine rather than masculine, or at least primarily feminine rather than masculine. Now, the second point here is that, well, there is toxic masculinity. There is behavior of men who behave badly, and it is the case that when men go bad, they tend to go bad in a certain way. But this is actually caused not by an overabundance of masculinity, not by people being too masculine or by having too much men around. It's actually caused by the lack of masculine influence. That's what causes these problems. And the strongest evidence of this is that there's a strong correlation between fatherless boys and violent men who behave badly. Essentially, many men are no such thing, but are just little boys who happen to have fully grown bodies. Many of them have had no one to teach them how to become a man. This dynamic is not a guarantee that a boy will fail to mature, but it just makes the failure far more likely. There's always going to be some people who beat the odds and become really good men even though they had no fathers, and there's always going to be some people who had fathers who turn out to be really bad men anyway. But generally speaking, this dynamic works. As Christina Hoff Sommers says, 30 years of research suggests that it is the absence of the male parent that is more often the problem. The boys who are at most risk for juvenile delinquency and violence are boys who are literally separated from their fathers. Now, back in 1960, there were 5.1 million single mother households. In 1996, it was 16 million. And in 2009, it was 24 million. And as I cited above, that's only expected to keep going up and up and up. Thus, there are countless men who, as the quote from Fight Club goes, are now a generation of men raised by women. And this is a huge problem because manhood is mimosis. That is, to be a man, a boy must see a man. A woman, no matter how good, compassionate, and well-meaning she is, simply cannot instruct a boy on how to become a man. So what we have now is that there are countless boys in full-grown bodies who are not men. And for many of them, it's simply because no one was ever there to show them how. And this isn't just my claims. This all fits very well with the research a number of people have done. Elaine Kamarak has done a study on the correlation between crime and single-parent households. And she says this correlation is so strong that, quote, controlling for family configuration erases the relationship between race and crime and between low income and crime. That is, what she's saying there is essentially that those other factors, that is race and income, don't even really make a substantial difference when you look for whether or not the person was raised in a single-parent household. That skyrockets the crime rate, is what she's saying. Cynthia Harper and Sarah McClanahan did a 14-year study where they tracked 6,000 boys aged 14 to 22, and they concluded that before any markers of socioeconomic disadvantage were separated out, the association between family type and incarceration was highly significant, with youths in single mother and mother-stepfather households, as well as those who did not live with their parents, facing incarceration odds at least 3 times as high as youths within mother-father households. Or, as the Washington Post summarized this research, boys whose fathers were absent from the household had double the odds of being incarcerated, even when other factors such as race, income, and parents' education and urban residence were held constant. I'm not sure of the discrepancy between her directly saying it's 3 times high and the Washington Post saying it's 2 times as high. Maybe the Washington Post was trying to bring in some other factors there, but the point still stands either way that, hey, if you're a boy coming up in a single-parent household with just your mother or your mother and a stepfather, your odds of incarceration skyrocket, irregardless of any type of race or socioeconomic status. So David Blankenhorn aptly sums all this up. He says that while there certainly are exceptions, the rule is this: boys raised by traditional masculine fathers generally do not commit crimes. Fatherless boys commit crimes. Now, fatherless might even affect philosophy and religious belief. Paul Vitz argued this in an essay, The Psychology of Atheism, and also in a book titled, it wasn't the same name, it was, what was it? Faith of the Fatherless, The Psychology of Atheism. So, well, kind of the same name, but not quite. Anyhow, he argued there that atheists usually have problems with their fathers. That is, their fathers abandoned them as children, they were weak men, or their fathers abused them. Now, it's a well-argued and evidenced essay in that Vitz is able to point to many examples of famous and prominent atheists who had troubles with their fathers. I read a kind of a comic biography of Bertrand Russell a while back. I think I mentioned that I'd read that on the podcast here called Logicomics, which is a pretty well-done story about Russell. And his parents died very young, when he was very young. He had virtually no contact with his father, and then for a brief period of time, it looked like he was going to be raised by his grandparents, but then his grandfather died, and he was essentially raised, according to at least this little biographic I read, by his grandmother, who was very stern and strict and kind of what we would call a religious fundamentalist. So that's just one example of how that might be the case. Now, Vitz is even cautious enough to warn that his theory may not be right all the time. He says that we're lucky in psychology if we're right only 60 or 70% of the time. So he's granting the possibility that it's not always going to be the case that somebody with a bad father turns out to be an atheist. Now, generally speaking, a well-functioning society will be able to pick up the slack for those boys who are fatherless. This is typically done through other social and cultural institutions whereby a boy or a young man can interact with and see older, mature, and responsible men, such as clubs, institutions, and things along those lines, either ran locally in the community or by a church or things along those lines. And I'm sure you can think of many examples of places that were like that. Clubs and institutions like this, where men can interact with only other men, or conversely women with only other women, have been the norm for most human societies. Traditional Judaism, the various Christian denominations, and Islam all have long traditions of gender-separate activities. These traditions embrace the truth that children and teenagers must be taught by adults, not by one another. However, now, for a number of reasons, one of which is the obsession of our culture with the appearance of equality, these institutions are either gone or have been greatly diminished in scope. Men-only clubs started to be cracked down on after a 1987 Supreme Court decision that allowed states and cities to ban sex discrimination by gender-orientated clubs. And you can easily think of, say, the example of the Boy Scouts, who were forced to recently open up their ranks to girls, so it's not a male-only institution anymore. Now, while generally speaking, equality is a good thing, at least usually and most of the time, the unintended consequence is that society has now lost a number of safety nets that could have helped catch those boys who were failing to become men. As Sachs explained, when boys' clubs shut their doors, there was no other convenient venue remaining where grandfathers, fathers, and teenage boys from different families could come together, shoot the breeze, and share their experiences. The typical American teenager doesn't hang out with middle-aged adults on the weekend anymore. The typical American teenager hangs out with other teenagers. Now, I'm 37 years old now, so when I was a teenager, it was 20 years ago or more, and I can tell you that that was true even 20 years ago now, and it's only gotten worse. And the problem here is that a boy is likely to become the kind of man he sees around him. If the boy has no strong, competent male role models to look to, he will absorb ideas from his peers, who are going to be just as clueless as him, and from the media, which, as I've already talked about, is extremely hostile toward strong, competent men. This is one of the very obvious lessons that we could take from Orenston's article in The Atlantic, and she nearly accidentally stumbles across it when a few of her subjects that she's interviewing remarked that their fathers were absentee or unworthy of respect, that is, they were weak, stupid, and foolish and selfish, or something along those lines. But she just completely ignores this point and thus fails to recognize that the young boys she is interviewing likely picked up their bad ideas of masculinity from their peers and the media. That is, they weren't taught them from strong, competent role models. Thus, as she's appalled by the bad behavior of the teenagers and young men she's talking to, she ends up blaming masculinity for their bad behavior instead of realizing what the problem actually is. She said, quote, "Boys may know when something is wrong. They may even know that true manhood, or maybe just common decency, compels them to speak up. Yet too often they fear that if they do, they'll be marginalized or, worse, themselves become the target of derision from other boys. Masculinity then becomes not only about what boys do say, but about what they don't, or won't, or can't say, even when they wish they could." But I would submit here that if her interview subjects had little or no positive male influence, then the reason these teenagers and young men act like complete and utter buffoons, and if you read her article, they do, when she interviews anyway. Anyhow, it's very likely the reason for this problem is that there were no older, mature, competent men stepping in and saying to these kids when they were young teenagers and children, "No, that's not how a real man talks about women, and that's not how a real man treats women. Here's how you do it. Here's why this is wrong." A boy will simply not become a man without another man showing and telling him how. Instead, he'll become a violent, immature buffoon or a worthless, lazy bum. Now, some fatherless boys who have no good examples to look to will still beat the odds. There are people who can do that. There are men who become good men despite all the odds being stacked against them. But how much better if we don't have the deck severely stacked against them? So the point here is that despite what the media would have you think, what that UN report would have you think, what Gilligan, Orenstein, and Mansfield, and many, many others would have you think, the root cause of toxic masculinity is not too much masculinity, but rather it is the absence of masculinity. That is, in there having no fathers or good men around to look to. A writer named Abigail Schreier has even gone so far as arguing that having a traditional masculine father will make girls, their own daughters, more confident later in life. So it's not just good for boys, but good for girls as well. So as Hoff Sommers has summarized, 30 years of research suggests that it is the absence of the male parent that is more often the problem. So in one of the books I was reading to do research for this, Leonard Sachs relates a story that he got from a guy named Craig McLean, who's a co-founder of a group called Boys to Men, not the singing group. This is a completely different thing. This Boys to Men is an organization that mentors teenage boys. McLean had hired a boy to do some chores around his place, like pulling nails out of old lumber. But when McLean returned 30 minutes later, the boy was sweating and frustrated. The boy had been using the blunt end of the hammer. Nobody had ever shown him how to use the lever end of the hammer to pry nails loose. He simply didn't know what the lever end was for. So McLean took the hammer from the boy and in less than a minute showed him how to use the correct end of the hammer. McLean sees this story as a metaphor for the plight of many young men today. They have never been trained in the tools of traditional manhood. They come of age angry and frustrated because the tools don't seem to work. Yet it is not the tools that have failed. The culture has failed. The culture has not provided a community of men to train the boys. And the end result of that failure is an angry young man with a hammer in his hand. Now, cycling back to the beginning, remember Long, that mass murderer who I opened up by talking about? Well, a typical mass shooter like Long is a young male who's used drugs, legally or illegally, dropped out of school, committed or planned suicide as the grand finale to his murder. But to focus on those characteristics is to arbitrarily look at the 12 to 24 months before the shooting. It ignores the roots of the problem, which is the household this person came up in, or at least usually that's the problem. So it's no wonder that in 2015, Peter Hasson did some research, looked a few things up, and concluded that in the U.S. in the 10 years prior, of the worst mass shootings, 7 of those shootings had been committed by young, under 30 males. Of the 7, only one, the Virginia Tech shooter, who had been mentally unstable since childhood, was raised by his biological father throughout childhood. So why does it seem like there's a rise in the amount and severity of mass shootings while overall violent crime is way, way down? Which, go look at like the FBI crime statistics. Overall violent crime is way, way, way down. The data here argues that at least one of the causes is that many boys are raised by women and simply don't know how to be men. Now, most of them will simply become passive men who don't know how to do anything. But some become angry, frustrated, inappropriately aggressive, and violent. Sometimes the angry young man doesn't have a hammer like he does in McLean's story. Sometimes he has a gun. And fitting very well with this pattern, it was reported that Ian David Long, that mass murderer at the Borderline Bar and Grill in California, he also grew up without a father, as his father died of cancer very early in Long's life. Now, there's also one further argument here I'm going to make against equating toxic masculinity with traditional strong male role models in masculinity. With the massive rise of boys who are growing up without a father, if the problem really was found in father figures and traditional masculinity, then we should find the general well-being of men, young men and boys, increasing. But we don't. As I hope I've demonstrated by now here, by most every objective measure that I can find, men in America are doing worse since the rise of single-mother households. If the problem really is that masculinity is inherently bad, removing or lessening the masculinity present in the boy's life should make things better. But this is the exact opposite of what the data has shown us. As masculinity and male influences have been removed from the lives of young boys, things have gotten worse, much worse, not better. Hence, what I want to argue is that combating this toxic masculinity is best done by promoting positive, or what I'll call responsible masculinity, in the sense of fathers and other good, strong, and competent role models. Responsible masculinity means in part defending people, including women, against such exploitation. That is, we need to look to and find men who are selfless, honorable, and value these traits more than just being strong and capable. It's far, far more important to be selfless and honorable than it is to simply be competent and strong. However, as Joe, that veteran I talked about who was a victim of massive amounts of fraternity fraud, his story and that professor's media research demonstrates, society often shames, demeans, and takes advantage of men who are even attempting to take such responsibility. This reminds me of what C.S. Lewis said. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. An American society holds a U.S. Marine who was fighting in Afghanistan responsible for children who are not his, and then is shocked that men don't want to get married or make sacrifices for society anymore. Now, this all seems to paint a pretty dire picture, so this might leave you asking, as the crowd did on the day of Pentecost, well, brothers, what shall we do? And I won't leave you hanging. I actually do have a few ideas as to what we can start doing about this. So, in the first book of the Narnia series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when discussing Aslan, the Christ figure for those of you who haven't read those books, Mr. Beaver says of him, "Safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you." And this is what we actually need men to be. Not safe, but good. A rabbit is very, very safe. But a rabbit is good for nothing other than food for a larger creature. It's basically useless unless you want to eat it. Likewise, a safe man is pretty much a useless man, at least most of the time. And there have been many people, institutions, and organizations and movements in American society for the last 50 years or so that have been desperately trying to make men safe. And to some extent, that's understandable, because you don't necessarily need violence and aggression in a relatively safe society like ours, like you probably did hundreds and thousands of years ago. But what these people, organizations, and movements never realized is that making men safe also makes them useless. Or even worse, what happens is that you fail to make men safe, and you've prevented them from becoming good. Hence toxic masculinity. But despite the best efforts of society to make men into rabbits, there are still good and unsafe men who put the needs of others above their own. Good and unsafe men pushed and pulled people out of the windows to save them from Long's rampage in California. Unsafe good men saved people's lives that day. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't say, "Oh, can I touch you?" They grabbed people, pulled them out of windows, and they saved lives. The same thing has been seen in many other mass shootings. In the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooting in 2012, 3 young men, John Blanc, Matt McQuinn, and Alex Tebes, died by shielding their girlfriends from the bullets. In the shooting in Parkland, Florida, Aaron Feiss, a teacher there, threw himself in front of bullets to save some of the students. A witness said later that he was running toward the sound of the gunshots. Or consider the much more recent example of Jack Wilson, a 71-year-old who shot and killed a mass murderer at a church in Texas on December 29th of just this last year, 2019. The shooting was over in seconds because Wilson stopped the murderer with a single shot. Now, a safe man will definitely not carry a firearm into a church. But in this case, a good man did, and it's extremely likely he saved the lives of many people by doing so. A good but unsafe man is what the Bible teaches men to be. John 15:13 promotes selflessness over selfishness, saying, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend." We see this reflected in the pattern of Christ, who gives up his life for everyone. Now, there is nothing safe about shielding other people from gunfire with your body or letting yourself be crucified. But it's very, very good. In Ephesians, Paul instructs men to actually lead their families to take charge, but to do so in a loving and sacrificial way. A man must lead his family by using his ambition, aggression, and desire to dominate, but he is to use those traits in the service of others, not himself. Paul explicitly says that fathers are to raise their children in ways that enable them to do right. If more men had followed Paul's teachings, it's quite likely that many things in American society would be much better now. That's what all this data that I've given argues. Now, the vast majority of claims that I made in the essay and in this podcast here, I think should be unsurprising to most people. I've said men and women are different. I've said that treating an entire class of people like they are stupid, vile, and unwanted will cause some of those members of that class to act out or in turn check out. I've claimed that children need their fathers, and it's devastating to them on many levels when their fathers abandon them or are forced away. And also that despite the odds being stacked against them, there are some men who are so noble that they will still serve and sacrifice for a society that actively betrays them. And yet these claims and many similar ones are actually controversial in contemporary America these days. That fact alone says a great deal. So, when a crisis comes, and it really counts, there will always be at least a few men of honor who run toward the sound of gunfire and put themselves between actual toxic masculinity and everyone else to protect everyone else. This behavior is not toxic. It's the exact opposite of toxicity. And we dishonor men like Aaron Feiss, who gave his life to save those students, and do a grave disservice to our society when we claim otherwise. If we want there to be less useless and angry men and more men like Feiss, then we all need to be fathers to our children and stand up to a society that mocks honor and then wonders aloud why so few men display any honor. And this example just came to my mind, but do you want to know why so few of our leaders and politicians in this country display any sense of honor or integrity? It's because our society has spent so long mocking people who display or try to display honor and integrity and throwing them under the bus for it. Eventually, you're not going to get very many people of honor standing up when you go out of your way to mock them for it. They're just going to check out for the most part, excepting those very, very few who are just so honorable that you're never going to get them to check out no matter what you do. Well, that's the extent of the essay, or podcast version of this essay anyway, because I did do many little asides and things like that I wouldn't do if you were just reading the essay. And I hope you really enjoyed that, appreciated it. I like that I was able to get at least some use out of this essay since the conference was canceled. If you have any feedback, especially any pushback on any parts of the podcast I gave today, I would really appreciate that, because one of the things I really, really enjoy about giving essays at conferences is the feedback and pushback and discussion, the Q&A that you get after you give an essay. That's where the real meat of things comes out, and that's what I really enjoy the most. So I'm missing that this time. So if you have any of that, send it my way. You can always reach me for any comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or send me a message or leave me a comment on the Facebook page, The Examined Life with Phil. Just do a search for that and you can find it. We're getting close to 500 likes on the Facebook page. It'd be cool if we could get over that. So if you enjoy the work I'm doing here and like listening to my podcast, share the Facebook page with other people and promote that and see if we can get it over 500 likes and get some more people interested in the podcast. I'd really enjoy that. I hope you all are staying safe out there, isolating, and have got all the food and supplies you need to keep yourselves and your families safe as we go through this time. And thanks again for listening. I'll be back again with another podcast next week. Not quite sure what that'll be yet, because things are a little bit in flux here as they are everywhere, but I'll definitely be back with something again for you next week. Thank you much.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.